I never thought signing up for a dog obedience class would turn into the highlight of my week, but here we are. I was just trying to get Max to stop dragging me down the street every time he saw a squirrel, not to accidentally stumble into this whole thing. And by thing, I mean the guy the first couldn't stop noticing every Tuesday evening at the community center. So picture this. It's a chilly early spring, those awkward kind of evenings where you want to wear a jacket but end up sweating because you're walking a hyperactive golden retriever named Max. Max is, in a word, a disaster when it comes to basic commands. Sit was more like, quote, pretend to sit, and stay basically translated to explode with excitement. I figured, okay, obedience class, why not? Maybe he'd listen, and maybe I'd stop looking like a complete mess every time we went to the dog park. The community center's gym was a little run down, with faded lines on the floor and chairs pushed to the side. It smelled faintly of old sneakers and cleaning spray, but the energy was lively. Around 20 people showed up that first night, all clutching leashes and trying to keep their dogs from turning the place into chaos. And then there was him. I noticed him the second the instructor introduced the group. Tall, easy smile, kind eyes that somehow made you feel like he was actually interested in what you had to say, not just pretending to listen. His dog, a sleek black lab mix with a perfectly shiny coat, was sitting calmly at his feet, looking like the goodest boy in the room. And here I was, crouching down trying to untangle Max from his leash, who was already doing some sort of excited twist move that looked like a combination of a dance and a rebellion. I tried to play it cool, but my heart did a weird little skip when our eyes met briefly. He gave me this small nod, like, hey, I see you're in the same boat, and then turned his attention back to his dog. That moment stuck with me more than it should have. Over the next few weeks, we kept showing up at the same time, side by side in this slightly awkward but kind of comforting routine. Our dogs barely acknowledged each other, but we started exchanging little comments about how stubborn they were or what treats worked best. Eventually, those comments stretched into real conversations about work, favorite hiking spots, terrible first dates. It's funny how something as simple as an obedience class can start feeling like this little island of normal in an otherwise chaotic life. I didn't expect to meet anyone there, especially not someone who made me want to suddenly care about how Max did his sit or whether my new jacket looked good enough to impress the guy with the Calm Lab mix. But then, last Tuesday, everything shifted. And it all started when Max decided to completely ignore the instructor and bolt across the gym like he was training for an Olympic sprint. At that exact moment, the guy I had been quietly admiring all these weeks didn't just laugh or roll his eyes. He sprinted after Max, calling his name with this mix of amusement and genuine concern that made my chest tighten. That's when I realized this class was about a lot more than just obedience. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. Max, of course, was having the time of his life, dashing around like the world's largest squirrel had just appeared right outside the gym door. The instructor was yelling something about recall and leash control, but honestly, I barely heard her over my pounding heart as I watched the guy with the lab mix spring up from his seat and chase after Max like it was no big deal. He called out, "Max, hey buddy, come on man, let's go." His voice was calm but insistent, like he genuinely believed Max would listen because he meant it. I was standing frozen for a second, feeling this weird mix of embarrassment and admiration, mostly embarrassment, because this was the exact opposite of the controlled, obedient dog owner image I had hoped to project. But then Max skidded to a halt right in front of him, tail wagging like crazy, and the guy crouched down and clipped the leash back on with ease. Max looked up at me like he'd just done me a favor by running wild, and I half expected to hear the guy chuckle, but instead, he smiled and said, "He's got a lot of energy." "I'm Jake, by the way." I blinked, suddenly aware I hadn't even introduced myself. I'm Matt. Sorry about Max. He's a handful." Jake shrugged, standing up and brushing dust off his jeans. "No worries. Some dogs just need to burn off a bit more steam. You're not the only one looking like you lost a wrestling match with your dog." That broke the tension enough for me to laugh, and somehow That moment felt like the start of something less awkward and way more promising than I expected from a dog class. The rest of the session was a blur. Max was still a bit all over the place, but having Jake nearby made the whole thing feel manageable. At the end, as people gathered their things, Jake turned to me with that easy smile again. "Hey, if you ever want to swap tips or just need a break from the chaos, maybe we can grab a coffee after class next week?" I almost said no because, honestly, who was I kidding? But instead, all I could do was nod and say, "Yeah, that sounds great." The following week, I showed up a bit early, Max already practically vibrating with excitement, probably because he sensed something was different. Jake was there too, sitting on a bench with his phone in his hand, his black lab mix, Winston, lying calmly at his feet like a furry Buddha. "Hey, Matt," Jake said, standing up as I walked over. "Coffee's on me today. I've discovered a place nearby with the best espresso. Seriously, it's life-changing." We walked out of the community center together, dogs in tow, and ended up at this tiny cafe a few blocks away. I learned Jake was a graphic designer who worked freelance, which explained the laid-back vibe and his slightly perpetually messy hair. He asked about my job in marketing, and we swapped stories about the weird quirks of working from home. It surprised me how easily the conversation flowed. There wasn't that usual anxiety I felt when meeting new people, especially guys I found attractive. With Jake, it was like talking to an old friend I hadn't realized I was missing. At some point, Max decided to get underfoot, making me stumble a little. Jake laughed, reaching out to steady me. "This one is definitely the more energetic of the two," he joked. "Understatement of the year," I replied. We spent the next few weeks in this strange, wonderful routine. Tuesday obedience class, coffee afterward. We'd share tips on training, swap funny stories about our dogs, ridiculous antics, and sometimes we'd just talk about life. Little by little, the casual chats started to carry this quiet, electric undercurrent that I couldn't ignore. There was one night, just a few weeks into the class, when we ended up walking our dogs together in the park after class. The sun was setting, casting this warm, golden light over everything. Winston trotted calmly beside Jake, while Max was still bouncing around, sniffing everything like he was on a mission. We stopped on a bench, and Jake pulled his jacket tighter around him. I was trying not to stare too much, but the way the light caught his profile made me realize I was way more distracted by him than I wanted to admit. So he said casually, like he was reading my mind, "Have you ever thought about how weird it is that we spend all this time trying to teach dogs to be obedient, when really, they're just being themselves?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Yeah, and meanwhile, I'm the one who feels like I need the obedience lessons sometimes." Jake's smile softened. "Yeah, I get that. Life's a bit like training a dog, huh? You mess up, you try again, and sometimes you just have to be patient. For some reason, that hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because lately, patience wasn't exactly my strong suit when it came to matters of the heart. Over the next few classes, the easy friendship we'd built started to feel like something quietly intense. I caught myself looking forward to seeing Jake, not just because of the dogs, but because of him. And yeah, I could tell he felt it too. One evening, after everyone had packed up and left, Jake and I were the last ones in the gym. Winston was snoozing in his bed, and Max was finally calm, lying at my feet as I absent-mindedly petted him. Jake looked over at me, a little nervous, but hopeful. "So if I asked you out for dinner, maybe this weekend, what would you say?" My heart was beating way too fast, and for a second, I couldn't even answer. Then I just smiled and said, "I'd say that's the best idea I've heard all week." That was the moment I realized that obedience classes were just the start, not only for Max's training, but for this unexpected, amazing thing happening between me and Jake. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see where it would go next. That weekend came around faster than I expected, and suddenly, I was standing outside this cozy little Italian place Jake had picked. I'd thrown on something that felt like it struck the perfect, effortlessly casual balance, which in reality meant I was way more nervous than I was letting on. Jake was already waiting inside when I arrived, dressed in a simple button-up shirt that looked way better on him than anything I owned. He greeted me with that easy smile that made my stomach do that weird fluttery thing, and took my hand in his for just a moment before we sat down. I swear, just that tiny touch set off a chain reaction of all the dumb little butterflies I'd been trying to ignore all week. Over pasta and some pretty excellent red wine, we talked about everything and nothing. Our conversation felt effortless, like we were two old friends catching up, rather than two guys awkwardly navigating a first date. He told me about the time he'd accidentally signed up for a marathon because he misread the date, and I shared the story about Max destroying my favorite pair of shoes the day before class started. At some point, Jake reached across the table and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm really glad we met," he said, and something about the way his eyes looked at me made me realize I felt the same way. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the wine. After dinner, we took a walk around the neighborhood, dogs in tow again, the evening cool but comfortable. The streetlights cast a soft glow, and for the first time since I could remember, everything felt right. Like maybe I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We stopped on a quiet corner, and Jake looked over at me, voice low. "So, what's the plan for Max's obedience? Think he's gonna graduate anytime soon?" I laughed. "Honestly, I'm just hoping he stops trying to eat everything in sight without choking." He grinned. "Same, Winston's a bit of a food thief, so it sounds like both our dogs are troublemakers." That's when he did something I didn't expect. He leaned in just slightly, close enough that I could see the faintest ridges of freckles across his nose. Neither of us said anything, but I could feel the electricity humming between us. Eventually, he pulled back with a nervous chuckle. "Well, maybe this is the part where I finally ask you if you want to come over sometime, for a proper doggy playdate, and maybe some more wine." I didn't hesitate. "That sounds perfect." The next afternoon, I showed up at Jake's place, Max bouncing at my heels, and Winston sitting patiently by the door. Jake greeted me with that same shy grin, and I realized just how much I was starting to crave his presence. Inside, his apartment was warm and inviting, cluttered with art supplies, dog toys, and a few plants that looked like they were doing their best to survive. We settled into the living room, the dogs immediately chasing each other around like they'd known each other forever. Jake poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat close on the couch, the kind of comfortable silence settling between us that only happens when you don't feel the need to fill every moment with words. At one point, Winston jumped up and rested his head on Jake's lap, and I found myself watching the way Jake's fingers gently ruffled his fur. It was small, quiet, intimate, and I wanted to be a part of that. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and said, "I'm really glad we did this. All of it." Jake looked up at me, eyes shining. "Me too." Without thinking, I reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. The air shifted, and for once, all the nervousness melted away. He leaned into the touch, and our lips met, soft, tentative, but full of everything I'd been feeling these past weeks. Afterward, we just stayed there, tangled up on the couch, the dogs curled up at our feet like little anchors grounding us in that perfect moment. But as much as everything felt right, part of me still wondered what came next. Would this be just a fleeting thing? Or was this the start of something deeper? Turns out, Jake had been wrestling with the same questions. Over the following days, we texted constantly, sharing goofy dog videos, random thoughts, and quiet moments of vulnerability. He admitted he hadn't dated seriously in a long time and was scared of getting hurt. I told him I felt the same. One evening, we met at the park again, the place that had become our unofficial meeting spot. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't before. "I don't want this to be just a dog thing," I confessed. "I want to see where away it can go." Jake took my hand, fingers intertwining with mine. "I was hoping you'd say that." We sat there for a while longer, the dogs chasing each other in the fading light. And I realized that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. Like a dog obedience class that turned into a lesson on love. After that night in the park, things started to feel different. Not in some flashy, headline-making way, but in the quiet, subtle way that happens when two people start melding their lives together without even realizing it at first. Like how Jake's mornings began to include a very persistent Max wagging his tail against his leg, demanding breakfast at an unreasonable hour, and how I found myself texting Jake during the day just to share some random dog meme or a dumb thought that popped into my head. One Tuesday, as we headed back into the community center for class, Jake nudged me with his elbow and said, "You know, I think Max is actually getting better at sitting." I glanced down just in time to see Max plop himself down with a little huff. "Who's a good boy?" "That's right, you are," I said, ruffling his ears. Max looked pleased, and I caught Jake's smile, the kind that made you feel like maybe the world was okay after all. Our dogs were still a bit wild, no miracles there, but somewhere between the clumsy heel attempts and the occasional successful stay, Jake and I were figuring out the rhythm of us. The easy conversation, the quiet understanding, the way our hands found each other naturally when no one was looking, it all felt like home. One night, a few weeks in, Jake invited me over for dinner. He'd been experimenting with this pasta recipe he swore was foolproof, and honestly, I was mostly there for the company. We ate in his cluttered kitchen, laughter spilling as Max and Winston tussled nearby, the kind of noises dogs make when they're both exhausted and ecstatic. After dinner, we collapsed on the couch, Jake pulling me close, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my arm. There was a warmth in those moments that made all the stupid anxieties about dating and all the what-ifs seem distant. I felt safe, like I could breathe. But, of course, real life has this fantastic way of reminding you that nothing's ever that simple. A few days later, I got a text from my sister. She was coming into town for a few days and wanted to catch up. That was fine, except my family, while loving, weren't exactly the most open-minded bunch. I hadn't come out to them yet. Honestly, I wasn't sure if the timing was right or if I even wanted to. I told Jake about it over a late-night call, my voice betraying the nerves I was trying to hide. It's not that they'd be mean or anything. It's just complicated. Jake was quiet for a minute, then said, "I get that, but you don't have to rush anything. We'll figure it out together." Hearing that made me feel a little less alone. But the knot in my stomach didn't completely untangle. The weekend arrived, and, true to plan, my sister came over. We had a good time catching up, and eventually, the conversation turned to my love life. She was curious. Too curious, maybe, but I danced around the topic, offering vague answers. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. Later that evening, Jake showed up unannounced with a bottle of wine and a peace offering. Homemade brownies. He didn't push anything, just sat with me as I wrestled with my feelings. "You don't have to tell them anything until you're ready," he said softly. "But maybe one day, when you're ready, I want to be the guy standing beside you." I looked at him, really looked, and saw all the honesty and hope in his eyes. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. Days passed, and as the visit ended, I realized that holding back was starting to weigh on me. I wanted to share this with the people who mattered in my life. Not just the dogs, not just Jake, but everyone. So one evening, I invited my sister and Jake over, both a little nervous, but ready to face whatever came next. We sat around my small apartment, the dogs curled up together for once, and I took a deep breath. "I want you to meet someone important," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Jake reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it gently. My sister smiled, and for the first time, I felt like maybe this was the start of something new, something real. We've come a long way since that chaotic first obedience class, Max still dragging me down the street on occasion, and Winston always up for a game of fetch. But now, it's more than just dogs in training. It's about building something that feels like a home, with Jake, with Max and Winston, and maybe, in time, with the people who make up my world. And honestly, I can't wait to see what happens next. After that evening with my sister and Jake, things didn't suddenly become perfect, but there was this new sense of possibility hanging in the air. Like maybe the walls I'd built around myself were starting to crack, just enough for light to get in. It was subtle, but it made a difference. Jake and I settled into a comfortable rhythm, which, if you asked Max, was mostly about who could give the biggest handful of treats. We were still navigating the ups and downs of getting to know each other more deeply, and I found myself learning things I hadn't really expected, like Jake's incredible patience, not just with the dogs, but with me. He'd listen to me ramble about work stress or my weird family dynamics, and never make me feel like I was being too much. And I noticed how he'd always make an effort to include Max and Winston in everything, like they were part of this little family we were quietly building. One lazy Sunday afternoon, we found ourselves at the dog park, the place where it all started. Max and Winston were chasing each other around like maniacs, and Jake and I sat on a bench, sharing a bottle of water and watching the chaos. "I think they're teaching us more than we're teaching them," Jake said, grinning. I laughed. "Yeah, like how to live in the moment and not worry so much." He nodded, then looked at me with that smile that made my heart skip. "You know, I've been thinking." I raised an eyebrow, suddenly curious and a little scared. Jake took a deep breath. "I know we're still figuring things out, but I want you to know I'm serious about this. About us. About building something real." His words hit me harder than I expected. I realized how much I'd been holding back, afraid to fully commit because of all the what-ifs. "I want that too," I said quietly. "Even if it's scary." He reached over and squeezed my hand, and in that moment, all the doubts felt a little less heavy. The weeks that followed were a mix of excitement and challenge. Jake and I navigated the everyday stuff, meeting each other's friends, juggling work schedules, and occasionally stepping on each other's toes, mostly me accidentally hogging the bathroom. But through it all, there was this growing sense of trust. One evening, Jake invited me over for dinner again. This time, he'd cooked a full meal, and the apartment smelled amazing. We ate by candlelight, the dog snoozing on the rug nearby. After dinner, Jake pulled out a small box. My heart raced before I even knew what was inside. He smiled nervously. "I've been working on this for a while." Inside was a simple handmade collar tag for Max, engraved with his name and a little paw print. Thought Max deserved something special. I was touched in a way I didn't expect. "Jake, this is amazing." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I just wanted to do something that shows we're in this together. All of us." That night, as I lay in bed afterward, I realized that this relationship was more than I'd hoped for. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, messy, and full of moments that made me smile even on the toughest days. A few weeks later, Jake and I decided to take a weekend trip out of town, just the two of us and the dogs. We found this quiet cabin near a lake, surrounded by trees and the kind of silence that makes you realize how loud life can be when you're not paying attention. During our hikes and late-night talks by the fire, I felt myself opening up even more. I told Jake about the moments when I still felt scared, the times I doubted whether I was ready for this kind of love. And Jake, in turn, shared his own fears and hopes. One evening, as we sat wrapped in a blanket watching the stars, Jake looked at me and said, "I want to keep building this with you, no matter what." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the fire. Me too. That trip was a turning point. When we came back, I felt stronger, more certain that whatever came next, we'd face it together. Back home, the obedience class was winding down, and our dogs had improved a ton. They still had their quirks, but now they seemed to reflect the bond Jake and I were building. Sometimes chaotic, sometimes calm, but always full of love. One Tuesday, after class, Jake and I stayed behind, sitting together as the gym emptied out. Max and Winston lounged nearby, tails wagging lazily. Jake looked at me, eyes soft. "So what's next for us?" I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Whatever we want it to be." And honestly, that felt like the best answer I could give, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just hoping for something good, I was living it. A few weeks after that conversation in the empty gym, life started to feel like it was moving in fast forward, but in the best way possible. Jake and I had officially become us, whatever that looked like. We were making plans, sharing playlists, and even arguing over who gave Max the better belly rubs. Spoiler, it's definitely Jake, but I'm stubborn. One Tuesday night, after class, Jake surprised me by suggesting we try something new. "How about we take the dogs to that new, dog-friendly cafe downtown? I've heard it's got killer coffee and a relaxed vibe." I was game. Anything that meant more time with Jake was a yes in my book. The cafe was exactly what it promised. Cozy, with exposed brick walls and a whole corner dedicated to dogs, complete with water bowls and treats. Max and Winston settled in quickly, exhausted from obedience class, but still curious enough to sniff every table that passed by. Jake and I sat across from each other, menus forgotten, as we talked about everything and nothing. The easy rhythm of our conversation felt like the soundtrack to my new normal, and I found myself stealing glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking. That smile, bright, genuine, had this way of lighting up the whole room, and I felt ridiculously lucky to be across from him. After a while, Jake dropped his voice a little, looking a bit more serious. "So, I've been thinking about the future. Not in a scary way, but maybe we should start talking about moving in together." I blinked, caught off guard, but in a good way. It wasn't that I wasn't ready, I just hadn't expected him to bring it up so soon. "Really?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, eyes focused on mine. "Yeah, I mean, we spend most of our time together anyway. And I think it would be nice for all of us, me, you, Max, and Winston, to have one place to call home." The idea spun around in my head. Moving in together was a big step, but the thought of waking up next to Jake every morning, sharing late-night coffees, and watching the dog snuggle on the couch, it felt right. "Okay," I said after a moment, a smile tugging at my lips. "Let's do it." From there, things got busy, in the best way. We toured apartments, argued over paint colors. Jake wanted gray, I was lobbying hard for warm beige, and slowly merged parts of our lives. Max's favorite chew toy made the move, as did Winston's collection of squeaky balls. The first night in our new place was a bit surreal. Boxes everywhere, dogs running around like they owned the place, which they pretty much did, and Jake and I sitting on the floor with takeout because the kitchen was chaos. We toasted with cold beers, and Jake grinned. Welcome home. That word home felt heavy with meaning. It wasn't just a place, it was this cozy bubble we were building together. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were days when Max decided to redecorate the living room with shredded cushions, and nights when Jake and I disagreed about the thermostat setting. He likes it cold. I'm a furnace. But even in those moments, we found a way to laugh, to compromise, to hold on to whatever this was becoming. One chilly autumn evening, we wrapped up a long hike with the dogs and headed back to the apartment. As we peeled off layers, Jake pulled me close, his breath warm against my neck. "You know," he murmured, "I'm really glad we took a chance on that obedience class." I chuckled. "Yeah, who knew bad dog behavior would lead to this?" He smiled wide, fingers tracing patterns on my arm. Best accident ever. That night, as Max and Winston snored softly at our feet, Jake and I talked about everything. The past, the future, and all the little moments in between. I realized that love wasn't about perfect timing or grand gestures. It was about showing up, day after day, for each other, and for the crazy, wonderful life we were building. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see where the next chapter would take us. Months passed, and with every day Jake and I spent together, I felt more certain that this was something real, something worth holding on to. Our apartment was little more than a joyful mess most days, with dog toys scattered across the floor and an ever-growing collection of memories tucked into the corners. But it was ours. Our space where laughter came easy and quiet moments felt just as important as the big ones. One Sunday afternoon, after a slow morning of breakfast in pajamas and a long walk with Max and Winston through the park, Jake and I found ourselves sitting on the couch, the dogs curled up beside us. The light was soft, filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow that made the whole room feel like a cozy haven away from the world. Jake looked over at me and smiled, that familiar, gentle expression that always made me feel like I was exactly where I belonged. "You know," he said, "I never thought a dog class would end up changing my life." I laughed, shaking my head. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it did." He reached out, taking my hand in his, fingers lacing naturally with mine. It was simple, no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just a steady, quiet connection that said everything without words. In all the chaos with Max and Winston, Jake continued, "You've become my favorite kind of unpredictability. I want to keep building this with you, My heart swelled, and I squeezed his hand gently. Me too. No matter what comes next. We sat like that for a while, just holding on to each other, content in the comfortable silence that only comes from knowing you're not alone. Looking back, it's kind of funny. A dog obedience class seemed like such a small thing at the time, just a way to get Max under control, but it turned out to be the start of so much more. It gave me Jake, gave us this life filled with laughter, patience, and love that felt honest and steady. And honestly, I can't think of a better way for this story to end than with two dogs finally learning to behave, and two people learning how to be there for each other. Because sometimes, love isn't about fireworks or perfect moments. It's about the quiet, everyday things that make life worth living. And for me, that's exactly what we found.